countries in the region. When Vice President Joe Biden visited the country in 2013, he emphasized trade between the U.S. and China and did not focus on the South China Sea. Secretary of State John Kerry did the same in 2014. Meanwhile, Biden's son Hunter and Kerry's stepson Chris Hines carried out massive business deals with Chinese officials and the state-owned Bank of China. Worse, Hunter Biden and Chris Hines even invested in a Chinese nuclear company under FBI investigation. Can you imagine if their name was Trump? This is in a book by Peter Schweizer. He says, during a critical 18-month period of diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Beijing, the Biden and Kerry families and friends pocketed major cash from companies connected to the Chinese government. Schweizer's book delves into the ways in which American princelings profit at home and abroad from the economic and diplomatic policies of high-ranking U.S. officials. With former Vice President Biden rumored to be considering a 2020 presidential run, the scandals surrounding how his diplomatic efforts enriched his son take on renewed importance. His role in abetting China's aggression for family gain seems particularly damning, they write. When Biden became the vice president in 2009, his son Hunter Biden, became a social fixture in Washington. And Schweizer explains this in his book. In the summer of 2009, the vice president's son joined forces with Chris Hines, a wealthy heir to the late Senator John Hines, whose wife Teresa married John Kerry. The two formed Rosemont Capital, an alternative investment firm, quote, positioned to strike profitable deals overseas with foreign governments and officials with whom the U.S. government was negotiating. Devin Archer, Chris Hines' roommate at Yale and star fundraiser for John Kerry's 2004 presidential run, joined the American princelings at Rosemont. Federal agents would later arrest Archer in May 2016 for defrauding a Native American tribe in an effort to enrich a branch of Rosemont Capital called Rosemont Seneca Bohai. Now, these American princelings set up Rosemont Capital as this alternative investment fund of the Hines family office and attached several branches to it. When Vice President Biden went to China in December 2013, amid the South China Sea aggression, his son Hunter went with him. Hunter Biden was negotiating a major deal between Rosemont Seneca and the state-owned Bank of China. As the vice president discussed China's trade with the United States, his son was putting these economic ties into practice, and the U.S. effectively caved in the conflict over the South China Sea. 10 days after the Bidens visited China, the Bank of China, which is embedded in a complex network involving state ministries, security forces, and the Communist Party, and which provides capital for China's economic statecraft, created an investment fund with Rosemont Seneca called Bohai Harvest RST. In short, the Chinese government was literally funding a business that it co-owned, along with the sons of two of America's most powerful decision-makers. Rosemont Seneca received a benefit no other Western firm had in China, as Schweizer writes. A private equity cross-border investment fund formed in the Chinese government's Shanghai Free Trade Zone. With this privilege, Rosemont Seneca could take Chinese government funds and invest them in China or outside the country, or even in the U.S. As the vice president caved on the South China Sea, and as his son benefited from this lucrative deal, China ramped up its aggression, forming islands and transforming these artificial islands into military bases with airfields, runways, ports, aircraft systems. In July 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry visited China. While the Chinese government had disliked Hillary Clinton's unipolar voice, they found Kerry a much more willing ally. When President Xi Jinping called for a commitment to boost Sino-U.S. economic ties, Kerry echoed the call. China and the U.S. represent the greatest economic alliance trading partnership in the history of humankind, said John Kerry. Meanwhile, a former subsidiary of the Chinese government, Gemini Investments, aimed to purchase Rosemont Realty, another branch of the Rosemont Capital Tree run by Hunter Biden, Chris Hines, and this fella Devin Archer. Rosemont Realty had put the mayor of Santa Fe on the bankroll and purchased New Mexico's largest commercial real estate company, BJK. After acquiring trophy buildings, the company prepared to be purchased by the Chinese company, that is, Gemini Investments. Gemini Investments is considered an indirect subsidy of the Chinese government. It's operated by its parent company. And it goes on. The Chinese, well, you get the drift. Hunter Biden and Chris Hines made a fortune off of special deals and privileges from the Chinese government, financial relations with the Chinese government, and the implication here is quite serious, that Joe Biden and John Kerry basically looked the other way as China was incredibly aggressive. I'll be back. Now, this was in the New York Post. You think it's just the Democrats? Mitch McConnell. Again, this is in the Peter Schweizer book, and we'll have Peter here for some time on Friday. He says, in 2004, current Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his wife, current U.S. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, this is written by Larry Getlin, referring to his book, Schweizer's book, had an average net worth of $3.1 million. Okay, that's 14 years ago. But 10 years later, in 2014, that number had increased to somewhere between $9.2 million and $36.5 million. So they went from 3.1 to between 9.2 and 36.5. How did they do that? One source of the windfall, according to a new book from Schweizer, was a 2008 gift from Chao's father, James Chao, for somewhere between $5 and $25 million. But this gift could be seen as more than just a gift. It may have been acquired, according to Schweizer, thanks to the couple's fealty to China, the source of the Chao family fortune. And that fealty may have occurred at the expense of the nation they had pledged to serve. Secret Empires, this new book, details myriad examples of corruption from members of both political parties. Rather than focusing on direct forms of corruption, such as bribes, Schweizer hones in on more indirect graft of the modern era. Rather than risk their careers taking bribes for potential minuscule rewards, Schweizer points out how today's politicians are savvier, engaging in what he calls corruption by proxy. While politicians and their spouses are often subject to rigid regulations on what gifts they can accept and what sort of businesses they can conduct, others around them, like their friends or children, have no obstacles. And you just saw that with Biden and Kerry. So while a politician can theoretically wind up in prison for accepting $10,000 for doling out favors, establishing overseas connections that could land your children multi-million-dollar deals is harder to detect and often legal. Foreign governments and oligarchs like this form of corruption because it gives them private and unfettered gateways to the corridors of Washington power, Schweizer writes. Foreign entities cannot legally make campaign contributions, so using this approach creates an alternative way to curry favor and influence America's political leaders. Simply camouflaging these transactions as business agreements provides another shield of plausible deniability. Now, as Schweizer tells it in his book, Elaine Chao, the Chao family, remember she's married to McConnell. The Chao family fortune derives from the Foremost Group. Notice they set up all these institutions. The Foremost Group, a shipping company that Chinese native James Chao, her father, and a classmate of former Chinese President Jiang Zemin at Jiaotong University, founded in New York in 1964. So he founds this Foremost Group in New York in 1964. Chao remains Foremost's chairman today, and his daughters Angela and Christine are the company's deputy chairwoman and general counsel, respectively. Elaine Chao worked there in the 1970s and has been quoted as saying, shipping is our family tradition. Now, the success of Foremost, this company, is largely due to its close ties to the Chinese government, in particular the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, a corporation with which Foremost has done large volumes of business. Now, this company, the Chinese State Shipping Corporation, this state-run company by the Chinese government, or the CSSC, Schweizer writes, is a state-owned defense conglomerate at the heart of the Chinese government's military-industrial complex. The main goal of this Chinese company is to strengthen the Chinese military. Now, James and Angela Chow have both sat on the board of a CSSC, this Chinese government company, off of a offshoot of that company. They've sat on the board. While Foremost, the Chow company, is an American company, their ships have been constructed by Chinese government shipyards, and some of their construction financed by the Chinese government, he writes. He says, in addition, their crews are largely Chinese, despite U.S. Transportation Secretary and company founders Elaine Chao having once said that ships crewed by Americans are a vital part of our national security. Given all this, it's worth noting how both Mitch McConnell, and Elaine Chao, in their roles as high-ranking U.S. officials, have personally interacted with and then gone considerably soft on China since their 1993 wedding. When Senator McConnell, who took hardline positions against China prior to his marriage, met with high-ranking Chinese officials in 1994, it was not in his capacity as a senator, but via a personal invitation from the CSSC Chinese company arranged by James Chow, Elaine's father. McConnell met with Zemin, then the country's president, and Vice Premier Li Langqing. After this meeting, McConnell, quote, would increasingly avoid public criticism of China, unquote, and more meetings like it would follow in the years to come. Schweizer writes, as the Chows and the Chinese government went into business together, the Chows McConnells tied their economic fate to the good fortunes of Beijing. Were McConnell to critique Beijing aggressively or support policies damaging to Chinese interests, Beijing would severely damage the family's economic fortunes. In the ensuing years, is this boring, everybody? Is this boring you, Mr. Producer? I think it's stunning, absolutely shocking and disgusting. In the ensuing years, McConnell has loudly defended China in the actions against Hong Kong and Taiwan, even claiming that the United States needed to be ambiguous as to whether we would come to the defense of Taiwan if attacked by China. When the late Senator Jesse Helms introduced the Taiwan Security Enhancement Act, pledging support for Taiwanese independence in 1999, it had 21 co-sponsors and heavy Republican support, but McConnell was not on the list. When Congress required China to document annual progress on human rights in order to maintain its trade status in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, ditching the requirements became a priority for the country. In 2000, McConnell co-sponsored S-2277, which would do just that. McConnell also fought attempts to punish China for vigorously undervaluing its currency, a tactic that led the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid to invoke the nuclear option, changing Senate rules on voting. The bill passed 63-35 with McConnell voting against. Now, Elaine Chao has also done her part to support her ancestral home. When she served as Secretary of Labor under George W. Bush, her department resisted efforts to, quote, call out the Chinese government over its workers' rights practices, as Schweizer writes. When a petition was filed against China on the subject of workers' rights, based on the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, Chao opposed it. After a bipartisan congressional report citing Chinese espionage against the U.S. circulated in 2000, Chao, Schweizer writes, was critical of the report, making clear she in no way agreed with its findings, and Schweizer writes, dismissing the idea that China could pose any threat to the United States. So this dishonest double-dealing works on both sides of the political aisle. And it goes on into other individuals and other matters as well. The Bidens, the Kerrys, McConnells, the Chows. All this going on in the shadows. All this going on behind our backs. These are supposed to be public officials. They and their families are getting filthy rich. And America is getting weaker and poorer as a result. And they dared to stand there and attack this president and his family? Collusion? Well, it looks like Biden's son and Kerry's stepson were colluding with the Chinese. Collusion? Somebody should ask Mitch McConnell and Elaine Chao about collusion. And then I see this today, ladies and gentlemen, from CNBC. China and Russia are aggressively pursuing hypersonic weapons, and the U.S. can't defend against them, top nuclear commander says. Now, we're going to talk about this briefly. But when you have all these activities going on, people are self-dealing, and yet they do it in a way where they can deny it. This kills a republic. This is the Senate Majority Leader. This is the Secretary of Transportation. This is the former Vice President of the United States who wants to be President of the United States. Former Secretary of State who wanted to be President of the United States. Is this what they mean by carrying out an effective foreign policy? It really makes you wonder how China could continue to build and build and build up its military with almost no pushback for the last 10 years. There's not going to be a special counsel to investigate these people. But the injustice of it, and even more, its destructive nature to this country, is unconscionable, absolutely unconscionable. Mitch McConnell should be removed for all the reasons I've said before, but especially now, as Senate Majority Leader, and there ought to be an ethics investigation looking into his background. And I am damn serious about it.